Bonsoir, chers invités, distingués représentants des corps diplomatiques et consulaires, Madame la sous-ministre des Relations internationales et de la francophonie du Québec, honored guests, je suis Dominique Toupin, chargé d'affaires et directeur des affaires économiques à la Délégation générale du Québec à Londres. I am the chargé d'affaires and director of economic affairs at the Quebec Government Office here in London. C'est un grand honneur pour moi de vous souhaiter la bienvenue à la 9e édition de notre conférence annuelle du Québec. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you here today for the 9th edition of the Quebec Annual Lecture. I want to thank you for being with us tonight in such high numbers. It's a very special year, and we are grateful for being able to hold this event in person. Yes. Nous avons également le bonheur ce soir de saluer tous ceux et celles qui se joignent en ligne avec nous en direct. You can tweet tonight about this event by using the hashtag Quebec Annual Lecture. Welcome to the British Film Institute, home to the world-famous film festival in London, and thank you to the BFI's great team for your support and collaboration. The Quebec government has had a home in the UK since 1962. We are nearly 60 years young. From arriving, we have worked hard to enhance our ties with the United Kingdom, the Republic of Ireland, and the Nordic countries in various sectors such as economy, innovation, culture, academic affairs, and so on. And we have done it with great people and partners such as you. The Quebec Annual Lecture, as its name implies, is an annual event introducing the excellence and creativity demonstrated by remarkable Quebecers who have contributed significantly with their accomplishments in their respective fields on an international scale. To start off with, a big thank you to our financial partners. Your support is essential for making tonight possible. Fasken, a law firm born in 1876, has been very supportive of the Quebec Annual Lecture from the beginning. We are fortunate to have them on board again this year, and we are so pleased to have one of their partners in the audience tonight, Mr. Peter Villani. Thanks for being here. Je tiens également à remercier la Banque nationale du Canada, the National Bank of Canada. I've been also a loyal supporter for many years. Simon Côté, General Manager and Managing Director, NBC London, and François Levert, Head of Fixed Incomes, Currencies and Commodities, are here tonight representing BNC. Merci Simon et François. I also want to thank la Caisse de dépôt et de placement du Québec, CDPQ, a pension fund which invests in various sectors all around the world and supports the development of Quebec's economy. David Morley, Managing Director of the office in London, is with us. We are grateful, David. Matthew Grisani, representing CGI, is here tonight. CGI is amongst the largest IT and business consulting firms in the world. We are proud of this Quebec-founded company. Their support over the years has been invaluable. Matthew, we are pleased to have you with us tonight. Marc Deschamps, from the firm Awendio, Strategic Tech Corporate Finance, is also with us tonight. Bonsoir, Marc, and a big thank you for your support. I also want to mention the multimedia entertainment company Moment Factory. who shared a part of this journey with us. Les créations de Moment Factory sont tout simplement spectaculaires. Ce soir, Marie-Pierre Veilleux représente cette belle entreprise. Merci beaucoup, Marie-Pierre. Lastly, a huge thank you to the SODEC, Society for the Development of Cultural Enterprises in Quebec, whose mission is to support the development of Quebec's film industry and cultural enterprises and ensure that heritage buildings are protected and promoted. This evening, we are honored to introduce to you our very special guest, with whom it is a huge privilege to spend an evening, Robert Lepage. Widely considered as one of the most influential living theater practitioners and hailing from Quebec, Lepage is a multi-talented artist. Cependant, avant que M. Lepage ne prononce sa conférence, permettez-moi d'inviter Mme Sylvie Barcelot, sous-ministre des Relations internationales et de la francophonie du Québec, à vous adresser la parole. Sylvie Barcelot is the Deputy Minister for International Relations and la Francophonie. Over to you.
Merci, Dominique. Alors, Monsieur Toupin, Monsieur Lepage, amis du Québec, distingués invités aussi. Alors, vous êtes ici avec nous et je salue aussi les gens qui sont avec nous en ligne. Bonsoir à tous, à toutes. C'est non seulement un grand plaisir, mais surtout un grand honneur d'être ici avec vous ce soir. I wish to thank the British Film Institute for welcoming us today for this annual lecture, which showcases the excellence, the genius, talent, and creativity of Quebecers whose work and commitments are recognized both in Quebec and here and internationally. Allow me, in turn, to thank all the partners and our sponsors with whom this activity would not have been possible. I would also like to congratulate and thank the guest speaker, playwright Robert Lepage. Mr. Lepage's international reputation is long-standing. For decades, his works, especially his stage productions, have contributed to shedding new light on human relations, bringing people closer together and promoting culture on all continents. He's also an innovative entrepreneur, as evidenced by his founding of a multidisciplinary, that's a very difficult word for me to say, with my Quebec accent. So the multidisciplinary company, Ex Machina, and the magnificent theater, Le Diamant Theater in Quebec City. The Quebec Annual Lecture is an opportunity to underscore the close ties that exist between Quebec and United Kingdom. It's a special way. This edition highlights the importance of the both partners that place culture in maintaining the relations. Culture is at the heart of Quebec identity. It's a true reflection of the best that Quebec has to offer all over the world. It is also a key sector of the Quebec's economy. Au-delà des différences linguistiques, la culture, c'est aussi l'un des meilleurs secteurs pour favoriser la coopération internationale. Et à travers cette créativité, la culture, on peut être vraiment en construction d'une meilleure compréhension, d'une compréhension plus profonde entre les nations. This year, lecture marks a return for a more normal life, so I wish. Indeed, the acceleration of the economic recovery has prompted the resumption of in-person cultural events to everyone's delight. I want to conclude by reminding everyone that next year it will be the 60th anniversary of the Quebec government in London. The festivities will be an opportunity to look back on the major milestones that have helped forge the strong economic and cultural relations and bonds of friendship that unite Quebec and the United Kingdom today. The Quebec Government Office in London is part of Quebec's extensive international network around the world, which comprises 33 offices in 18 countries. On behalf of the Minister of International Relations and la Francophonie, I thank you all for being here tonight. And je remercie d'ailleurs tous les membres de la délégation qui sont ici pour leur engagement constant et aussi le renforcement des liens entre le Québec et le Royaume-Uni. Et j'aimerais faire un bonjour spécial à quelques amis du Québec, spécialement Pierre-Gabriel Côté, qui était tout récemment délégué général, qui a eu l'initiative de cette soirée, et saluer aussi la nouvelle déléguée générale du Québec à Londres, Mme Lynne Rivard. Je vous souhaite à tous et à tous une belle soirée, et imaginez que c'est à moi que revient l'honneur de vous présenter notre invité ce soir. Puis après plusieurs tentatives, multiples tentatives de trouver la bonne façon de présenter notre invité, j'ai trouvé que pour être à la hauteur de l'homme, on ne devait donner que son nom, parce que son nom signifie à la fois talent, détermination, courage, imagination et grande générosité. Et surtout, il nous inspire une grande fierté. Alors, Monsieur Robert Lepage.
Madame la sous-ministre, Monsieur le délégué par intérim et Madame la nouvelle déléguée, distingués invités, bonsoir. So this is the only French you'll hear coming out of my mouth tonight. So I'm not obliged like politicians to start in French and finish in English. So good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be here tonight. When the Quebec delegation asked me earlier this year to come to London and give a talk about cultural relations between Quebec and the UK, I felt it was a duty for me to say yes, because I consider very often I've been treated like an enfant chéri by the delegation, benefiting from all of the resources that the delegation puts at the disposal of artists like myself to promote their work in London and in the United Kingdom. Of course, when the I just have to change the slide here if I want to be. There you go. There you go. So when the sorry about that. When the Quebec House was inaugurated in 1962, I was about 4 years old, so I'm not what you can call a privileged witness of the early days of cultural relations between Quebec and the UK. But still, at a very, very early age, I knew a lot about London. Because my mother, who had been stationed here in London during the Second World War, would go on and tell us all these fascinating tales and stories about the time that she spent here in London. My mother was only 18 years old when she joined the Canadian Women Army Corps. And here she is at the Borden Military Training Camp in Ontario, where close to 50,000 young Canadian women were rounded up before they were sent overseas. And from that number, about 1/5 of them were French Canadian. They were often lured by images like this one to join the army, or at least to join the war effort, promising to get about 80% of a man's salary and to look pretty in these beautiful uniforms, doing a lot of secretarial work for higher ranking officers, and at the same time get to do a lot of manly stuff like driving a military vehicle and getting to repair a flat tire. So of course, while my mother was still training, she had a very, very vague and very naive idea of what Great Britain was about. She had been told when she was young that England was much smaller than Canada. It was a very small island somewhere in the North Atlantic. And in the middle of that island, there was a fabulous city called London. And in the middle of London, there was a place called Buckingham Palace. And if you were lucky, you'd get to see the king and the queen and the lovely princesses go for a ride across London in their horse-drawn carriage. So she also thought that because England was an island, there was probably a lot of palm trees and a lot of very beautiful sandy beaches, and that the war was something that was kind of lurking very, very far in the horizon. Of course, she had a huge shock when she arrived in London just after the Blitz, when the population was still trying to surface from the rubble that had been left by all of the bombing by the Germans. So my mother ended up doing a lot of shoveling and bricklaying and even a bit of plumbing instead of all the secretarial work she had been promised she'd be doing in a posh office somewhere in Paddington. After the war, French-Canadian servicemen and servicewomen came back home to a very, very backward society. I mean, Quebec at the time was all about farming and mining, and if you were lucky, you might get a job in manufacturing. But there wasn't, a lot of possibilities, and a lot of, the future was quite bleak. And the premier of the province at the time was a man called Maurice Du Plessis. And in Canada, that's as close as you could get to a despot. He was in power for about almost 2 decades after the war, and he used a lot of patronage and a lot of repression to stay in power. He was a staunch anti-communist. He hated, of course, trade unions, and he made sure that the Catholic Church kept a very strong grip on anything that had to do with culture, education, or social services. So this period in Quebec is often referred as La Grande Noirceur, the Great Darkness. So this is a theatrical effect to illustrate my point. But there was a little glimpse of a hope in the late 1940s. There was a group of artists and intellectuals in Montreal who called themselves les automatistes, the automatists. Actually, they were abstract painters, choreographers, and poets that were very strongly influenced by the surrealist movement going on in Paris at the time. And these people got together and published a manifesto called Le Refus Global, the Global Refusal, which was basically an anti-establishment and anti-religious manifesto that asked for more freedom, less superstition, and the right to experiment. So it was basically saying God does not exist, let us live. So it was published, they managed to publish about 400 copies of it that they would sell $1 a piece. They got to sell about 200 copies, but it was a big uproar. The government and the authorities managed to have it banned, and the sale and the publishing of it was forbidden. And a lot of the automatistes had to either go into exile, or some of them lost their jobs as teachers. Some went to the United States, and a lot of them chose to go to Paris. And among the automatistes that chose to go to Paris, the most famous one was Jean-Paul Riopelle. Jean-Paul Riopelle was probably the first French-Canadian painter to be recognized or to be accepted internationally. He was accepted not only for his painting, but also for his personality. This guy was very charming. He was quite a hunk. He would dress up as a lumberjack, and the French intellectuals and art dealers were pretty much enamored with him and liked his personality a lot. And the surrealists nicknamed him Le Trappeur Supérieur, the superior trapper. So nobody knows it have anything to do with the fact that he was a womanizer. But Riopelle, at the end of the 40s and beginning of the 50s, created a series of paintings that he would call mosaics. So he had replaced the paintbrush for a palette knife with which he would apply the painting, and it would create a very, very textured, very sculptural kind of painting. So this was very, very popular, and very quickly found an agent and people to show his work in Paris. And in 1950, he came to London for the first time. There was an art gallery in Mayfair called René Gimpel, gallery. And René Gimpel and his sons were art dealers, and they were also art collectors. And of course, they favored French artists. So Riopel got to show his work at the gallery, but of course, he wasn't presented as a Canadian or even a French-Canadian painter. He was presented as a French painter. And that actually happened a lot during that time, because even there were like these collective surrealists or abstract art shows where the name of Riopel would be close to the one of Jackson Pollock or people like Willem de Kooning. And he was considered a Paris artist. Of course, it didn't necessarily mean that he came from Paris. It just meant that, you know, in those days, and certainly in the contemporary art, you came from the École de New York or the École de Paris. So your nationality was actually your art movement. In 1960, shortly after the death of Maurice Du Plessis, the government called for a general election, and the Liberal Party and its leader, Jean Lesage, were elected. They were a group composed of a lot of young lawyers, young intellectuals, social democrats who wanted to modernize Quebec society. Surprisingly, one of the first planks of their platform was to create a Ministry of Culture, which, of course, in Canada in those days, you know, nobody had ever heard about before. And so Jean Lesage declared, government does not create culture, neither does it control it. It merely attempts to create a climate in which the arts may flourish. So this might sound like an obvious thing today, but at the time it was a very bold statement. The Liberal government also created a Ministry of Education, because up until the Liberals, education was, as I said earlier, in the grips of the Catholic Church. The Liberal Party ran under this slogan, Maintenant ou jamais, maître chez nous. Now or never, masters in our own home. And of course, the symbol was a fist holding electrical bolts in their hands. So the Liberals had the intention to nationalize electricity. People should know that Quebec contains about 40% of Canada's water reserves. So it was very important for them to create economic wealth using hydroelectricity. So when they did so, Hydro-Quebec became the fourth greatest hydroelectrical power in the world, and huge chunks of the Manhattan skyline and large areas of New England still to this day are powered by the Quebec hydroelectric power dams. This, of course, brought not only a lot of wealth, but it changed a lot of mentality. You went from, you know, doing farming and mining, and suddenly you were in this this field of work that brought a lot of technological knowledge in Quebec. This also changed how Quebecers perceive themselves. You know, Liberals really helped Quebec change their attitudes, their mentalities, gave them a sense of identity for the first time. And the province of Quebec went from being the most religious province in Canada to the most secular. In 1961, they inaugurated a Quebec House in Paris, and in 1962, they felt they had to be represented also in London. So they inaugurated, at the time, the Quebec House was located at the Upper Governor's Street. And Jean Lesage himself inaugurated the house. And he started by doing his speech, like tonight, in French, and welcomed people into the house in the French language, which at the time was a very, very courageous thing to do. So it was saying, well, yes, Quebec is part of Canada. It is a province like other provinces, except it has this very distinct cultural element, which is the French language. For Quebecers. So as Quebec was taking giant steps to try to catch up with the modern world, culture and certainly popular music followed in the wake. And in 1964, the Beatles played at the Forum in Montreal. So, of course, you know, they were greeted by the usual crowds of hysterical women who would scream and faint and all that. And we all know that the Beatles changed, you know, pop music forever and all over the world. But in Quebec, it had a really, really, really strong impact and left a lot of traces. It was the beginning of the yé-yé period in Quebec. It's called yé-yé because I guess the songs went yé-yé. You know, the back chorus would go, yeah, yeah. So it was the yé-yé period in Quebec. And it created like a new modern pop culture. It wasn't based on folklore anymore. Suddenly, you know, they wanted to be like the rest of the world. So all these bands started to pop up. There was a plethora of Quebec bands that would emulate the Beatles. And for some reason, you would never see foursomes. You know, they'd like to imitate the Beatles. It would always be like either 5 or, in this case, 3. This band was one of the most successful bands in Quebec at the time. They were called Les Baronnets, and they would dress like the Beatles, have their haircuts like the Beatles, and they even push it as far as to recording Beatles songs that were poorly translated in French. And this guy here in the middle, his name is René Angélil, and yeah, so. About 30 years after that, he became the manager and the husband of Céline Dion and helped propel her to international stardom. But there was no such thing as international stardom in Quebec at the time. The problem with Quebec pop culture is that you could not export it. It was very difficult to export Quebec culture in the 60s. First of all, because of the language barrier. You didn't have access to the American market. And also, it was at the time where France wasn't interested at all in Quebec culture. The French countries, Francophone countries were pretty much patronizing us and making fun of our accents and saying that they didn't understand what we were saying and treating us, literally as peasants. So we didn't even have that option. Now, Quebec became very enclosed culturally for a long time. We were maybe a little village of 5 million Francophones in a sea of Anglophones for a long time in North America, and very few possibilities to export the culture. But it created a phenomenon which is a huge star system. People would keep their stars, they'd love them, they'd finance them, and they'd talk about them, and they encourage them a lot, which is the exact opposite problem of English Canada. English Canada, for a long time, until very recently, suffered of something called the Fpl Syndrome, which is short for frequent pregnancy loss syndrome. So it's a condition that some women have where the embryo doesn't stay in the womb very long, so they always lose the children. In English Canada has the most talented people in the world, certainly in the performing arts, and when you attain a certain level of excellency, you immediately go down south. So unless you're a writer or a painter, Canada is constantly being robbed of its excellence and of its great talent. So it's very difficult for English Canada to create a star system because they're all associated to the Americans. Of course, you hear the occasional CBC announcers saying Saskatoon's Joni Mitchell or Vancouver's William Shatner. But of course, these people have long been identified to the American culture. So it's very, very recent for English Canada that we start to recognize Canadian artists as Canadian. But at the time, they really were going through the exact opposite problem that Quebec was going through. So the thing also is that because Quebec was starting to have a sense of identity, nationalism started to show up, and culture progressively became a political argument. So in Quebec, not only you would read about art and culture in the entertainment pages, but you'd also get to read about it in the front page. About a month after the Beatles came to Montreal, Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth visited Quebec City. And of course, she was greeted by very different enthusiasm and crowds. My father brought me on the main streets where the motorcade was, and of course, when she drove past us, there was a lot of people around us who turned their backs to her. That's because by that time there was a new political party called Le Ralliement pour l'Indépendance Nationale, and they had organized this demonstration, and they demonstrated on the Plains of Abraham, very close to where the Queen was staying during her visit to Quebec. And to deal with the 680 demonstrators, the forces of law and order deployed more than 4,000 policemen, all armed with truncheons, who would hit people indiscriminately. So, of course, this day is still remembered as Truncheon Saturday. So up until Truncheon Saturday, political affiliation in Quebec was very, very binary. People would vote, conservative, or they'd vote liberal. But after Truncheon Saturday, you had to choose your camp between the separatists and the federalists. In 1966, Montreal very quickly had become this modern city. Montreal was the metropolis of Canada, and though the province of Quebec was, majority francophone, Montreal was considered a bilingual city. But in '66, it decided to have its own subway system, and it was modeled on the Paris metro. So this was, also another big statement, because most subway systems in North America are modeled on the London Tube. In 1967, this is really the year when Montreal was put on the world map for the first time. It hosted the World Exhibition. It was called, of course, Expo 67, and is still considered today as one of the most successful world exhibitions of all times. There was the usual array of very, very provocative architectural pavilions. There was about 90 of them representing different countries of the world, but also, for the first time, there was a communications pavilion, and there was a pavilion called the Labyrinth that had been imagined by Marshall McLuhan, who came all the way from Toronto to Montreal and worked with both French and English Canadians, filmmakers and people from the National Film Board, and created this extraordinary thing. He had, of course, coined the global village. He had coined the medium as the message, but there was a new expression around, which was multimedia, that had evolved from intermedia the year before, and it became multimedia. So multimedia was the big thing at Expo 67. And they created something, well, of course, this is a very, very small representation of what it was, but it was an architectural and filmic experience. People would be welcome in different rooms, and there'd be these giant projections and this pre-sense around sound around them, and it was all about the labyrinth in which we live and the different human experiences clashing and colliding. So this was a very important landmark in Montreal for multimedia, because after this experience, a lot of French-Canadian designers and filmmakers and theater directors were interested in this new way of approaching storytelling. So Montreal became a very important multimedia place, and it's also about immersive. This experience was immersive. You'd walk into these tunnels, and so it was a very, very exciting thing going on. This guy here is a pioneer animation filmmaker named Norman Mclaren. And Norman Mclaren was born in Scotland. He studied at the Glasgow School of Arts, worked in London for a while, did some animation film for John Greason, who at the time he was at the head of the Postal Service propaganda films, because it was just before the Second World War. During the war, he went to New York for a couple of years, and when John Greason was asked by the Canadian government to come to Ottawa to create the National Film Board of Canada, he needed the help from a very talented animator. So he asked Norman Mclaren to come to Ottawa. And with him, they created an extraordinary experimental film and animation place. And for a very long time, the NFB was a pioneer for that kind of filmmaking, that kind of innovation. But they were in Ottawa. And they knew that the talent was in Toronto and Montreal, basically. In Montreal, there was the École des Beaux-Arts that would produce all these extraordinary new talent. So they decided to move the NFB at the time to Montreal. And this is where the whole thing exploded. It was absolutely amazing, everything that came out of that. Norman Mclaren created films like Neighbors, which is probably one of his first famous film that he did, where he won an Oscar for. This was shot in a park, a public park on Mount Royal. He also would create these amazing stop-motion animations based on French-Canadian folklore songs. The NFB at the time were working a lot on trying to revolve the Quebec folklore, and of course that gave way to a lot of very modern and avant-garde film animation. Towards the end of his life, he started to partner with Montreal's Grand Ballet Canadien. He was very, very interested in the human form and creating kinetic visual effects with dancers. So this film actually won a BAFTA award in 1969. So at the time, creatively, in Montreal, there was quite an effervescence and attracted a lot of creative minds from around the world to come and do things in Montreal. During that time, there's a playwright called Michel Tremblay who wrote a play called Les Belles Sœurs. This was quite an event because up until Les Belles Sœurs, theater in Quebec was pretty much programmed by artistic directors that came from France, because we were still very colonized at the time, and we thought that only the French could actually tell us how to do theater and how to speak the French text and the great classics. And that changed when Tremblay came around with Les Belles Sœurs, because he felt it was about time that the lower classes and the middle classes be represented on the stage, and if that would happen, they would have to speak in the language that they actually speak in real life. So he wrote the play in a Quebec dialect at the time that people called le joual, which was a Quebecois way of how people used the French language in Quebec. And this was had a big effect because it was kind to show that not only we were trying to distinguish ourselves from the American culture or from the British culture, but also from the French culture more and more. So France had a very big, tight hold on what we were doing at the time, and this was the beginning of kind of freeing ourselves and trying to prove that we had our own culture. In 1969, John Lennon and Yoko Ono had just did a bed-in in Amsterdam and against the for peace and against the Vietnam War, but didn't get a lot of world attention. So they wanted to do one in New York, but they weren't able to enter the United States because of a marijuana charge. So they said, well, let's go to Toronto. So they went to Toronto, and the people who were following them says, you know what? Toronto's a bit of a prude city. I don't think it's going to happen. They're all English there. And it's so they said, why don't you go to Montreal? It's a much bigger city. It's bilingual. It's much more liberal. It's like crazy people there. You won't have any problems. The police are not going to arrest you, and you're going to get more media attention. And this is exactly what happened. So they rented a suite at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal, and what you just saw was the recording of the song "Give Peace a Chance." That was actually recorded in that suite. There was something going on at the time. All of this extraordinary international attention that Quebec was getting kind of blurred and eclipsed a reality that was a bit darker. The FLQ was a separatist terrorist group called, FLQ was Quebec Liberation Front, and through the 60s, they would plant bombs in mailboxes and decapitate a few statues because the separatism didn't necessarily come only from a cultural difference. Separatism was a working class struggle. It came from workers. If you spoke French, chances are you were part of the cheap labor, and if you spoke English, you were the boss. Of course, all that changed, but at the time, that was it was really clear cut that way. So the FLQ would try to draw attention to that problem and decided to go for kidnappings in October 1970. So they started by kidnapping a British diplomat at his residence in Westmount. 5 days later, they kidnapped the Minister of Labour. The British diplomat, after a lot of negotiations, was freed after about 2 months. But of course, the Minister of Labour had a more tragic fate. He was found strangled in the trunk of a Chevrolet that was parked by the FLQ somewhere in a parking lot in a military training base, actually. So this prompted Pierre Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada at the time, to invoke the War Measures Act. So, which is pretty much the equivalent of a martial law. So tanks started to roll in the streets of Montreal. Helicopters were hovering over the city. And this is the kind of street scene that you start to see in Montreal and in Quebec City, also in front of governmental buildings, banks, and important capitalist organizations. And so this was left a very, very strong impression on the youth in Quebec. And also this gave actually the permission to the authorities to crack down on political opponents. So they would arrest people without any warrants. They'd search houses. Dissenters who speak out were quickly silenced and without due process were taken off to jail. And this backfired. A lot of people in Quebec weren't for violence. They didn't support the actions of the FLQ, but they certainly did not want to see their civil liberties, being controlled or taken from them by the federal government with the martial law. So even though they weren't for the FLQ, 6 years later they elected a sovereignist government. They elected the Parti Québécois, who was a separatist government that promised a referendum. So during the end of 1970, the beginning of 1971, a lot of artists felt stifled, and even when the War Measures Act was annulled, a lot of writers and songwriters and poets, felt that this could happen any time now. They could be censured, and however, whatever you write, people didn't really know what to do at that moment. So the dance companies, this is Les Grands Ballets Canadiens, the main choreographer of Les Grands Ballets was a man called Fernand No, and he had choreographed Carmina Burana that was presented here at Sadler's Wells the year before to a very lukewarm it was a crowd. It wasn't very well received. But in the following year, he decided to create a ballet version of Tommy, which is the famous rock opera by the British group The Who. So this propelled them to international fame. They got to tour all over the world. The New York Times gave it a rave review. And this was a bit of a metaphor for how artists were feeling at the time in Quebec. They felt they couldn't speak anymore, like the hero of Tommy felt they couldn't see much ahead of them and didn't understand what was happening to them. They came to London eventually, where the show was met with a lot of success. And this is an interesting promo photograph that I found. And you'd think, oh, well, they did this to kind of attract London audiences to their show, but actually it was aimed at showing the people back home that had been in London because they're actually on a Canadian warship, and that's a Canadian war helicopter. In the early 70s, I was a teenager then, and Great Britain was still, where the best music came from, and a lot of Quebecois youth shared their passion for a new kind of music coming out of Great Britain that was called, well, we called it theatrical rock, but it was a progressive rock. So there was bands like, Pink Floyd, of course, at the time, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, but it was also more obscure bands like King Crimson or Gentle Giant that they would tour Quebec and tour Italy for some reason. Those were the two countries where they would sell tons and tons of records. And a year after that, they'd tour the U.S. So people were very fond of these bands because the music was very sophisticated, it was interesting, and also the shows were very, very theatrical. And there was a band at the time called Genesis, not the Genesis of today, but the Genesis of the 1970s, with a lead singer called Peter Gabriel, who came to Quebec City. And I was about 15, I think. Yeah, I was 15 when I saw this show. And it completely flabbergasted me. It was very theatrical. It was about not just about music, but also was about storytelling. Peter Gabriel would dress up in costumes, play different characters, would put on different voices to sing, would wear masks, would dress as a woman, as a fox. And there'd be these long sessions of mime. They'd be on stage, wearing black tights, and he'd do all of these mime things, telling the amazing stories. It was so theatrical. It was so interesting. It was all a lot of visual effects done very simply, with magnesium explosions and a few neon tubes and all that. It was very creative, very crazy. And I remember thinking, I want to do that. This is what I want to do for a living. So I wasn't a musician. I wasn't part of a band. But, I thought the closest thing to do was to study theater and become an actor, a writer, or a theater director. So the following year, I lied on my age, on the formula. I said I was 18, and I auditioned at the conservatory, and I was accepted. So they discovered that I wasn't 18 much later when they got into conversations with me, but that's another thing. And but for 3 years, I got to wear masks, put costumes on, play different characters, put on different voices, and try to do my very simple special effects. In 1976, Montreal tried to draw international attention to itself for the second time by hosting the Summer Olympics. So there was a big opening ceremony, very losh and all that. It was inaugurated by Her Majesty the Queen, but of course she was a bit nervous, having been here 10 years before, so she wasn't too fond of crowds in Quebec. But the sad thing was that we had been promised this extraordinary, beautiful architectural marvel, which was the Olympic Stadium. And because of very bad planning and because of a lot of trade union conflicts and construction union conflicts, the beautiful stadium was never completed in time for the inauguration of the Games. It was supposed to be this big concrete mass, which was like a big phallic symbol right there, hovering over the stadium. So it ended up looking like something out of a Hedwig and the Angry Inch. But there was something sadder going on at the same time that nobody in Montreal wanted to discuss. And I really kind of researched a lot of the French-Canadian television at the time, and nobody was mentioning what was going on at the same time. And it's because Toronto, very quietly, without making any noise, was becoming the metropolis of Canada. All of the money was there. There had been like a big wave of Asian immigration to Toronto. The Ontario car industry was booming. But of course, the political and social climate wasn't as tumultuous as what was going on in Montreal at the time. And to add insult to injury, the Canadian National Railway decided to build in the center of Toronto this giant concrete phallic symbol. At the time, it was the tallest man-made structure in the world. And of course, it had to be completed in time for the Olympics inauguration. So the eyes of the world were on Canada at the time. And a lot of people were saying, well, look at Toronto. And of course, Montreal doesn't seem to be able to get it up anymore. So this was a very, very depressing time in Quebec. In 1978, when I finished my conservatory, my studies, when you went through your 3 years of drama training, you were granted a 3-week workshop anywhere in Europe. That's what the Quebec government would do at the time. And of course, we often choose, my class at least, chose to go to Paris because, that's where it was happening theatrically at the time. There was the work of Théâtre du Soleil with Ariane Mouchkine, the work of Roger Planchon, and there was this amazing street scene. There was so many street theaters at the time. And but the most interesting stuff going on in Paris at the time was from a Brit called Peter Brook, who was probably one of the greatest influence in my work. And Peter Brook had chosen to move from London to Paris because he felt Paris was a better place to create his Center for International Theatre Research. Peter Brook had this amazing vision of theater. In 1970, this is a staging of Midsummer Night's Dream that he did for the RSC. And I remember studying each frame of a very grainy and lousy video pirate of this when I was in Quebec City, trying to understand how this man envisioned theater and how he staged it. So he was quite a remarkable artist and had a very, very big influence in what was going on in Quebec at the time in the world of theater. After my time in Paris, we were also granted an open ticket for a year. So if you had money, you'd take advantage of it and you'd travel all around Europe. I didn't have any money, so the only thing I could afford after my studies in Paris was to spend a week in London. So I was very eager to come here for the first time. And of course, I was disappointed not to find any traces of my mother's London. That had all vanished and everything had been rebuilt, and it was a very, very different place. Also, there was no traces of prog rock and theatrical rock. That was already passé, and London was at the height of the punk culture at the time. So this was about a year before the Thatcher years. So, the only thing I could afford, it was in the summer, so there was not a lot of theater going on, and so I'd hop the tube, and I'd often be sitting between a young girl with a lot of piercings and these purple mohawks, and on the other side there'd be a banker from the city with his umbrella and his bowler hat. So, London felt like an episode of Monty Python's Flying Circus, actually. But the thing I remember the most, the strongest impression I had of London when I came here for the first time, was that it felt like home, which was a really weird feeling. Because, in Quebec, when you're a French-speaking artist, and still today, you're, encouraged to go to Paris because, France is where your ancestors are, and you're going to find the sources of your work, who you are, your culture. People speak your language. They're your long-lost cousins. Blood is thicker than water. So we all go to France, But there's nothing more alien to Quebec culture than France. And I just come back from 3 weeks in Paris, and I love Paris. It's the greatest city in the world. But it's so not who I am and who we are. And at the time, it was, in 1978, in the height of, sovereignty and nationalism and all of that, it was a very difficult thing to admit. It sounded like a contradiction. But then when you come to think about it, we're part of the Commonwealth. We share the same kind of parliamentary system, and Quebec even found a way to adapt British common law to its own needs. So, if you have all of that in common, and if you've been brought up in that environment, even if you're a nationalist, even if you're francophone and Québécois, you're still profoundly British. And, that for a long time was a very difficult thing to swallow. Go, okay, wait a minute, how does that work? When I came back to Quebec, the Parti Québécois in power had decided to change the license plate's motto. So it used to be Québec, la belle province, but of course, if you're a sovereignist government, you don't want to see the word province. You want Quebec to be a nation. So decided to change it to Québec, je me souviens that year. And that motto is the sentence that's written at the bottom of Quebec's coat of arms. So people in Quebec started to look at that and didn't really know Where does that come from? You know, je me souviens, I remember. What is it that I'm supposed to remember? So it was immediately interpreted as a big nationalist thing. Oh, I remember the great heroes, the great Francophone heroes, and I remember that my culture was stepped on by the Brits, and now we've survived. And it's, you know, people's interpretations just went on and on and on and on. But I did a bit of research, and this is actually the first sentence of a first couplet of a poem that says, Je me souviens que né sous le lys, je crois sous la rose. I remember that even though I was born under the lily, meaning France, I grow under the rose, which means, of course, England. And the word je crois has a kind of a double meaning, because croix is a conjugation of croître, which means to grow, but it can also be interpreted as I believe. I believe in the English culture. So I started to, you know, wonder. I was walking in the streets of Quebec, and people say, je me souviens, and I was going, my God, you know. So I'd start these debates with other artists and say, well, you know what, probably the reason why we love British music and the British culture and we're so influenced by it and all that, because, you know, we're profoundly British. And of course, people would say, no, but most of these people had never been to London, had never been to the UK. And only much later, when Quebec companies and artists got to tour the UK, that I would start finding, you know, a similar discourse. A lot of the culture in the 70s was pretty much looking inwards. Quebec was pretty much a closed circuit at that time. Our preoccupations and our debates were all about the referendum that was going to happen in 1980. Whether you were promoting it with your art or if you were against it, whatever, that was what Quebec was about, the culture was about at that time. But of course, when the referendum was a resounding no, a lot of Quebec artists became rebels without a cause. You know, if this is not going to happen, or if it's going to happen much later, you know, what is it that I'm supposed to talk about? What is it I'm supposed to promote? Or what inspires me? Or what are my goals? And it was about at that time, in the early 80s, that both Quebec City and Montreal started to have these international festivals, dance festivals, theater festivals, film festivals. And a lot of artists understood that there was a world out there, and that they were tired of this kind of binary you know, conversation always between the French, the English, the separatists, the federalists, Quebec, Canada, and that was actually other countries and other artists from other countries and other cultures. And there was, you know, a place called Germany that was going, they had this great dance phenomena called dance theater, and, you know, the work of Pina Bausch, and they were very influenced by it. And artists started to travel, and they'd go to Japan, where there was an extraordinary modern performing arts scene. And also the performance art movement that was coming out of the basements of New York. So suddenly a lot of artists did not necessarily abandon the Quebec culture, but got interested in other cultures and saw that there was a, you know, a much more interesting, more complex world out there, and they could actually be influenced by it and try to not copy it, but borrow from it and do their own thing, and maybe try to find a Quebec culture that would resound a bit more, that would be more international, more universal. So it was a time where there's a lot of, and I'm part of that generation actually. It was tons of theater companies and dance companies that were very much influenced what was going on, and we'd borrow all the time, all these stuff we'd see in festivals or in our travels, and of course we'd try to use it in a different way. So this, of course, is La 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 Human Steps, very important dance company. From Montreal, who, of course, was a mishmash of all sorts of things, but it worked. Classical dance mixed with contemporary dance, a bit of acrobatics, a lot of martial arts, and even the gender lines were always blurred. The star dancer, Louise Cavalier, would be wearing a tutu, but she'd be bare-chested. She'd be more muscular than any of the other male dancers. She had a mustache. And in La La La, it very often would be the men that would be lifted in the air and not the women. So it was very urban. It was very courageous work. And this influenced not only the dance milieu, but influenced the theater, influenced the visual arts and the music. And in the theater, for a long time in Quebec, well, from like in the rest of the world, it was the playwright who was always at the center of everything. And suddenly, it was the director. The director was the one telling the story, and the playwright would have to move aside a bit. And text would be relegated to a secondary role. So suddenly, the language barrier wasn't as thick as it used to be. So when we did the Dragons Trilogy, it was a 75-year saga that crossed all over Canada, and it was about relationships between different communities and their Chinatowns. So we had decided that people would speak how they speak. So if it was a Quebecois character, he'd speak French, and he'd brush with a British character who would speak English, and then all the Chinese characters would speak Chinese, and the Japanese would speak Japanese. And we didn't really bother to try to find any kind of linguistic coherence through all this. It just kind of was all glued together, and it seemed to work. But it seemed to work in Quebec. But when we went to Toronto, to the Toronto International Theatre Festival, we thought this is never going to work here. We can't afford surtitling, and we can't afford any simultaneous translation, so this is going to bomb. And it was exactly the opposite happened, and we understood that the audience not only got it, but understood that the more local you were, the more universal you were. And everything that you express can be beyond words, and you recognize what a relationship between a mother and a son is, and you recognize how different cultural communities live together. And so a lot of what emerged from the work was understood by audiences who came from all over the world at this festival. And anyways, it was a big hit. We were surprised that it was so accessible and that people were moved and interested by it. And the London Times theater critic, Irving Wardle, was in Toronto for the festival, and he saw the show, and he gave it a really flattering review, saying, "I have seen the work of the new Peter Brook." And of course, he regretted that sentence just a few months later when he got to see some of my other work. But I wasn't the one who said that about myself, he was. But anyways, he said it, and it got a lot of attention. And so a lot of people started to care about what it is that we're doing. We're started to be invited in international festivals in different parts of the world. And of course, it caught the attention of Michael Morris, who at the time was the director of performing arts at the ICA. And Michael was very aware of this new thing that was happening in Quebec. He had already programmed work from Au Vertigo and work from La La La. So Michael gave us the opportunity to present our work for the first time in London. So we were, of course, very, very nervous. And it was a big success. It gave us a lot of credibility. And Michael became not only a good friend, but also was our biggest accomplice to promote our work and to help us tour our work across the United Kingdom. But also something happened with Michael that was interesting is that not only now Quebec companies were able to come and tour and show or flaunt their stuff here in the UK. But with Michael, we were able to establish relationships and start doing joint ventures with companies here or festivals. We do co-productions. And that was really like a new age of developing projects here in the UK. There was a time where I was wondering, what exactly is the appeal of that crazy Quebec culture at the time, where we're doing, nobody knew what they were doing. We just kind of mishmash all sorts of influence, and suddenly, it was a big hit, and people were interested by it. And when Cirque du Soleil came to London for the first time in 1990, in a small big top on the South Bank, and they presented a show called Cirque Inventé that they translated for Reinvented Circus. And the word reinvented, I think, is the key word at the time, is that Quebec was reinventing stuff. And, of course, we didn't know we were doing that, but, we're kind of reinventing the rules of our craft. Quebec is a very, very young society. It's, some of the oldest town is 400 years old. And of course, in America, it's an old town, but here it's, it's barely an adolescent. And that's what, at one point we understood that's the kind of society we are. Everything is to be invented. Everything is to be choreographed. Everything is to be written. And instead of trying to be number one and competing, let's try to be unique, find our own uniqueness. And this was really a golden period for Quebec culture, because Quebec was defining itself culturally and reinventing the rules of their crafts. Of course, Cirque du Soleil became what they became, this multinational, and became almost a permanent fixture here at the Royal Albert Hall, with amazing spectacles. So up until 1992, the Quebec delegation, of course, put a lot of its very limited resources to the service of people promoting or performing here in the UK, or doing exhibitions. But it was always very limited. The financial powerhouse for what we were doing, and the biggest support that we would receive was from the Cultural Affairs Service of the High Commission of Canada here in London. So they've always been extremely supportive. And of course, Quebec had all these kind of weird political things going on with that, and Canada always supported, without any opposition, anything that Quebec wanted. If we were invited here, they'd support us and they'd be proud of us. And they were very proud of our uniqueness. The way it would work is that an artist or a group of artists would receive funding from the federal to honor an invitation that received from a host here in the UK. And then the Cultural Affairs Department here at the High Commission would take care of the host. He would help him financially promote the work, organize opening nights and opening night receptions, organize press conferences, offer a room for if somebody needed an office, a tour manager, or whatever. So they've always been extremely helpful and very generous with Quebec culture. And we also had a lot of help from individuals, and somebody like Belle Shackman. Now, Belle Shackman was a very extraordinary and very unique person. She was somebody who grew up in Canada, of course, but she moved to London in the early '60s, and she was very important here. She was an arts patron, but she was also a fundraiser, and she had a lot of flair, and she would manage to convince top corporate executives that it would be important for them to put a lot of money in one of her ventures. And those weren't small ventures. She would invite the National Ballet of Canada and the Royal Winnipeg Ballet, and it was like really big projects. And she helped a lot of Montreal groups to come here. So she helped the Grand Ballet perform, and she also helped the symphony, the Montreal Symphony. But the thing that was extraordinary about Belle is that she put on these extraordinary opening night decorative spectacles and amazing food, and she was quite a socialite, so she would sprinkle these events with famous people and a few royals. So you'd see Princess Anne at an opening night of Le Grand Ballet, or Lady Di would make an appearance at the Montreal Symphony at the Barbican. So you'd remember the opening night event sometimes more than you actually remember the show. And she was an extraordinary woman. And her second husband was a man called Desmond Smith, and he was a very important Major General for the Canadian Armed Forces. And of course, he thought it was a pity that in London there was no monument honoring the 1 million and some 100,000 Canadian servicemen and women who had fought alongside the British troops through the two great wars. And before he passed away, Belle Shackman promised that she would make that happen. So in 1992, I had been invited next door at the National to stage my version of Midsummer Night's Dream, that was dubbed Midsummer Night's Dream, not because it was a bad show, but because it was set in a giant pool of mud, and so Belle Shackman knew that both my parents were veterans, and that my mother specifically had served here in Great Britain. So she knew it was a sensitive thing, a sensitive nerve. And so she asked me if I would agree to use one of the 8 previews of Midsummer Night's Dream at the National to raise money for this memorial. And of course, I agreed, but of course, I had my doubts. I thought, she's never going to be able to fill the Olivier room because, there's 1,000-something hundred seats there. And of course, I couldn't even afford the price she was asking for these seats. And I said, there's no way this is going to happen. And she said, you don't know the Canadian money in this town. There's a lot of money here from Canada. And of course, on the night of the actual event, I had never seen so many Bentleys pull up to the National Theatre entrance. And I was very impressed. And she had this great, great, great power. And she was a very generous woman. And she was a great art collector, and she knew all about Quebec artists, and she chose a Montreal sculptor to design the War Memorial that was inaugurated in Green Park in 1994. In '92, the Quebec delegation decided to ride the wave. There was more and more Quebecois artists showing their stuff here in art galleries and in theaters. And so they thought, well, maybe it's about time we have our own cultural attaché. So they hired Colin Hicks, a Brit, a local, a very cultivated man who spoke perfect French, who had spent some time in France, who had a huge network he was on the board of a lot of cultural institutions in London. And Colin knew a lot about Quebec culture, but also Quebec politics. And he knew how that was a tricky thing. And he was a remarkable cultural attaché. He was at the Quebec delegation between 1992 and the year 2000, and he established a model to promote Quebec culture here that is still, in place today. And apparently his budget went from $50 to $50,000, but the impact it had, it was really tenfold. So Quebec culture exploded pretty much in the 90s. And I won't go on and on and on about all this, the way of thinking, but I remember reading some of his strategy. This is only like maybe 6 points out of 140 points of his strategy. But he'd think, identify and partner with tastemakers, fund the buyers, not the artists, move the buyers around, support their actions, media campaign, be there on opening night, but focus on the next opportunity. So he was a very, very dynamic cultural attaché. He'd also say things like, cities are more flexible than states. Capitals like to be earned, so start with the second city. Also, Colin was very aware of the Scottish connection. Scotland and Quebec have a lot of similarities culturally, politically. We have the same contradictions, the same paradoxes. We go through the same debates. We are both cultures that have referendum, and we're always dealing with our we're always in an existential crisis, and that usually existential crisis gives a lot of good art, and so Scotland wasn't just a venue for Quebec culture. There was some really great collaborations that started under the reign of Colin Hicks. For example, Michel Tremblay, who wrote that play I was talking about earlier, Les Belles Sœurs, was translated in raspy Glaswegian dialect by two men, one called Martin Bowman and Bill Findlay, I think were their names. And this production was presented at the Tron and was later remounted at the National Theatre of Scotland. And this kind of opened up the way for a lot of Quebec playwrights. René Daniel Dubois and Michel Marc-Bouchard and all these amazing Quebec playwrights start to see their work being staged, not only in Scotland, but all over the UK. There you go. Colin was also instrumental in creating a Studio du Québec in London. So the Studio du Québec is in the Bowater district in East London, close to the Olympic Stadium. So it's a studio that's furnished, and it's a living space, but also a working studio. So artists from 12 different disciplines could come from Quebec and spend time there. And of course, they have to have at least 10 years of experience and of practice. And they use the studio to do work, do collaborations, meet people, or just flaunt what they do. The thing also that we're very comfortable with Collins is that it was nice to hear a Brit tell us that not only were interesting artists, but we could also have an influence on what was going on in the UK at the time, and we could even be able to teach stuff to people. So you'd see more and more Quebec artists like Edward Locke, who directed and choreographed a show for David Bowie. I got to do 2 world tours. I designed and directed 2 world tours with Peter Gabriel, who kind of hinted me to go into theater, and Xavier Dolan, a very talented film director from Quebec, got to work with Adele and still works with her on her music videos. So in the early 2000s, the Quebec film industry was going through some kind of a mutation, and a very advantageous one, because there was this boom of really interesting filmmakers like Denis Arcand, for example, who would not only have their film shown in festivals here, but would also find British co-production money. And so you had people like, for example, Denis Villeneuve, who was exactly, this change. I found this really cool picture. About 2 weeks ago, gave a lecture here for the film for Dune that he recently directed. So the Quebec film industry started to slowly be more and more independent from subsidies in Canada, and started to even do complete British productions here in England. In 2015, when I created 887, I did the world English premiere at the Edinburgh Festival. And of course, it was quite extraordinary, because I got to see how in so little time Quebec had taken like such an important place in the festival. I remember the days where if you wanted to have your name in that very thick fringe catalog, if you were Quebec, if you had a production there, and if the name of the production or your name didn't start with the letter A or B, the chances are you'd be, like page 675 or something. And of course, people just kind of didn't have any saliva left, to even get to your production. And suddenly we had our own catalog, and we were like, every year invited both in the official festival and in the fringe. And we, for example, that year there was more than, I think, 25 productions of, whether it's circus, dance, theater, and art exhibitions going on. So you could really see where we'd come from, and how the Quebec delegation had created a system to really kind of officialize and show the maturity of the work of Quebec artists. Now, for my closing comments, I'd like to draw your attention to actually one of our sponsors tonight, and I'm not doing this to kind of promote it, because I was going to use this example anyway to tell you as an example of how what Quebec has become in only 60 years. So it's a Montreal multimedia company based, they're based in Montreal, but they specialize in video and lighting, in architecture, and they do a lot of special effects for immersive experiences. Since their inception in 1991, their their success, really kind of was exponential, and now they have offices all over the world. And they have clients that range from the Sagrada Familia to artists like Madonna or bands like Muse or Imagine Dragons. So of course, they do a lot of work with the corporate world, but they also do these extraordinary experimental events and very poetic things where they light up complete forests, and their work is quite remarkable. They're based in Montreal. They have this kind of lab where they experiment, and they have the freedom to do whatever they want. So it's a very, very inspired group. And the reason why I chose them as an example is that, when you see what they do, they're really the inheritors of the 1950s, artists who wanted to have freedom to explore and to try things, and the 1960s harnessing of rivers to create electricity and light up cities and achieve electronic know-how, and the multimedia pioneers of Expo 67, and the reinvention philosophy behind the Cirque du Soleil and all of the performance movement of the 1980s. So, when you see them light up the skies, the night skies of the world, you really think, for me, I'm really proud, because you think, well, in 60 years, we've went from pulling ourselves out of the great darkness to try to create our own age of enlightenment. So I thank you very much.
Tout simplement, wow! Incroyable, what a journey! Monsieur Lepage, c'est extrêmement émouvant. Je dois vous dire, sans craindre de me tromper, que nous avons tous appris énormément ce soir. Quel lien fantastique vous avez fait, et quand vous dites que les Québécois se sentent bien au Royaume-Uni, c'est vrai. Merci, bravo. Alors, merci pour cette prestation incroyable. Thank you so much, Mr. Lepage, for an unforgettable evening. What a memorable way to start our 60th year. Wow. It has been an honor to share this journey with you. To all our guests who are with us tonight, we look forward to continuing the evening with you at the reception. The location will be indicated to you as you leave. We, of course, continue to kindly recommend that everyone wears a mask. And I would like now invite our sponsors, please, to come and meet us on the stage for the taking of photos. And to all of you, thank you very, very much. Have a good evening.